Imagine a weapon that took longer to prepare to fire than some armies took to conquer entire countries. A cannon that required a dedicated railway line to be built just for a single shot. The largest and most expensive artillery barrel in history, built to destroy a defensive line that the Germans simply went around. But what if I told you that's just the tip of the iceberg of this madness? That the real reason for the Gustav's failure is so absurd it was hidden behind technical details for decades, and that this 1,330-ton disaster is the perfect example of how you can lose a war right there on the drawing board. This video is the story of a weapon that missed its own war. You will learn what monstrous and humiliating ritual was needed just to load this gun, and why it managed fewer shots in a day than a regular artillery battery did in an hour. What happened to the 4,000 men assigned to a single barrel, and why these soldiers couldn't be sent to the front where their comrades were dying. How the world's most accurate shell could miss its target by a staggering 700 meters, turning a ridiculously expensive steel slug into useless junk, with each miss costing Germany a brand new tank. And most importantly, what simple yet shocking fact made German generals just shrug when their wonder weapon finally arrived at the front, only to find it utterly useless. This isn't a tale of power. It's a story of strategic blindness that cost millions, of how you can spend a fortune and 5 years of work to create the perfect key for a door that had already been picked. Ready to see how the most useless weapon in history was born? Then watch till the end.
Imagine an artillery piece the size of a multi-story building, a barrel 32 meters long, a shell weighing 7 tons, like a loaded truck flying out of the muzzle, a crew the size of an entire regiment. This is the Schwerer Gustav, Heavy Gustav, the largest gun in human history. Mountains of articles have been written about it. Its photos are known worldwide. Everyone knows this steel behemoth fired on Sevastopol, but almost no one talks about the real, stunningly absurd reason why this giant became a colossal, useless toy. The story of its failure doesn't start with technical glitches, but with a mistake in its very foundation, a strategic misconception baked into the project before the first ton of steel was even smelted. It all began in 1936. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with crushing all potential enemies, stood before a map of Europe. His gaze, like that of the entire German high command, fixed anxiously on the western border. There, like an impregnable steel spine, ran the Maginot Line, 400 kilometers of French fortifications, concrete forts with walls 7 meters thick, armored turrets, underground galleries. France, remembering the horrors of trench warfare, had created what it thought was the perfect defense. For Hitler, this was a challenge to be met and shattered. In a meeting with the leadership of the Krupp concern, the Führer asked a direct, seemingly impossible question: what weapon could destroy these modern fortresses? The answer from Krupp's engineers was as monstrous as the task itself. After calculations, they declared to guarantee penetration of 7 meters of concrete or 1 meter of steel from a distance beyond the reach of French guns, they needed a shell weighing 7 tons, and for such a shell, they required a gun of unprecedented caliber, 80 centimeters, with a barrel 30 meters long. The total weight would exceed 1,000 tons, and it could only move on specially laid double railway tracks. It was a project that defied common sense and logistics, and Hitler, enchanted by the very idea of absolute supremacy, approved it instantly. Money, difficulties, time,
all seemed secondary in the face of future triumph. Thus, the Gustav was born. Work began feverishly at the Krupp plants. The best engineers, including Professor Erich Müller, wrestled with titanic tasks: how to forge a single 80-centimeter barrel, how to transport thousands of tons of metal. While they solved equations of strength and ballistics with mathematical precision, forcing the Führer's fantasy into reality, the real world outside the design bureaus was beginning to change at a frightening, relentless pace. And these changes were preparing a blow for the project against which even the thickest armor was powerless. The gun was finished, but the war it was built for was already over. This was the monstrous paradox even Krupp's most brilliant engineers couldn't foresee. While they worked with German pedantry on forging the giant barrel, designing the unique 80-wheeled carriage, and perfecting the ballistics of the 7-ton shell, the world was racing ahead. In creating the Gustav, they were thinking in terms of the First World War, a war of static fronts, long sieges, and impregnable fortresses that needed to be methodically destroyed with monstrous firepower. They were designing the perfect key for the fortification lock called the Maginot Line. But the door they were bringing this key to had already been kicked open by another force, the swift, brutal genius of Blitzkrieg. In May 1940, German panzer wedges, bypassing the impregnable line to the north, sliced through France like a hot knife through butter. The war the French had prepared to fight from concrete casements was won on open roads in a matter of weeks. By June, it was all over, and by the autumn of 1941, when the Gustav was ceremoniously demonstrating its power to Hitler at a Baltic Sea test range, its original purpose wasn't just irrelevant, it had become a historical joke. The enormous sum of 7 million Reichsmarks for the second gun, Dora, years of labor by thousands of highly skilled workers, tons of scarce alloyed steel, all of it was invested in solving a problem the Army had already solved in a much more elegant and effective way. A vacuum of meaning emerged. The technically perfect product was a strategic relic. They had the weapon, but no target. In the headquarters, a strange, almost comical search for a use for this useless giant. The first idea was Gibraltar, the British fortress on the rock. The plan seemed logical: powerful fortifications, a worthy target. But it crashed against the dry reality of politics. Francisco Franco refused to let German troops pass through Spain. The Gustav was out of a job again. It was then that eyes turned east, where the grand and bloody drama of Operation Barbarossa was unfolding. There, in Crimea, German troops had been unsuccessfully storming Sevastopol for months, a fortress city with powerful coastal batteries and deep underground fortifications. The siege was dragging on, causing huge losses, and it occurred to the Wehrmacht command, what if we use our wonder weapon there? It was a fateful decision. It meant the Gustav, a breakthrough weapon created for a war in Central Europe, would now be used as a heavy sledgehammer in a local, albeit desperate siege on the very edge of the theater of war. It was sent not to open the way for armies, but to try and crack one specific, stubborn nut. Thus began the giant's long, humiliation-filled journey to the front, which for it became not an arena of glory, but a vivid demonstration of its own absurdity. The journey to Crimea was the first and most vivid lesson in the sluggishness of this steel titan. Transporting the Gustav was not moving a weapon, it was a full-scale strategic operation. A train of 25 special wagons laden with the disassembled barrel, carriage, cranes, and mountains of auxiliary equipment stretched for 1.5 kilometers. It was vulnerable to partisans and aircraft, slow, and required flawless work from railway personnel. But arriving at the destination near Sevastopol only opened a new act in this engineering drama. It turned out the giant couldn't fire from just any railway embankment. It needed its own, specially built world. For this, 4,000 men, soldiers, engineers, workers of the TOT organization, slaved for nearly 6 weeks under the scorching Crimean sun. They laid 16 kilometers of a separate railway branch from the main Simferopol-Sevastopol line. At its end, on the chosen position, a whole infrastructure sprang up. 4 semicircular rail tracks for the gun itself, outer tracks for assembly cranes, concrete foundations, warehouses for the giant shells and powder charges. The Gustav ceased to be a tool of war. It became the main military operation itself, swallowing up forces and time that could have been directed at the actual assault. When the first shot finally roared on June 5, 1942, the external effect was indeed devastating. Over 2 months of the siege, the Gustav fired 48 shells. The 7-ton armor-piercing shell, flying at twice the speed of sound, caused monstrous destruction. One of the most famous hits struck the underground ammunition depot, White Cliff, Biela Skala. The shell penetrated dozens of meters of soil and rock and exploded inside, destroying an entire arsenal. German observers and cameramen recorded the colossal explosions and geysers of earth, creating a powerful propaganda effect. However, behind this facade of a wonder weapon lay a completely different, merciless statistic. While the Gustav fired its individual shells with theatrical pomp, maximum rate of fire 14 rounds per day due to the multi-hour cycle of reloading, aiming, and cooling, ordinary German artillery rained an unceasing, relentless torrent of fire on the city every single day. Over the entire siege of Sevastopol, more than 30,000 tons of shells of all calibers were fired at its fortifications. The Gustav's contribution to this firepower was about 300 tons, roughly 1%. The price of that 1% was monstrous. The gun barrel, which had withstood hundreds of test shots, was completely burned out after these 48 combat rounds. The rifling was worn away, the metal fatigued. The unique barrel, whose creation took months, had turned into a useless tube. Thus, even in its only real combat operation, the Gustav demonstrated a catastrophic mismatch between cost and result. It did not decide the outcome of the siege. The city fell under the combined assault of the entire army. It merely added a few loud but tactically inconclusive chords to this symphony of destruction. And now this wasteful giant, stripped of its voice, had to be taken deep to the rear for a long and expensive repair, while at the front there was a desperate shortage of much simpler and more necessary things. Its meaningless wanderings across the maps of staff officers, searching for any justification for its existence, entered a new phase. With a fresh barrel, but with the old, unsolvable problem of lacking an adequate target, the Gustav set off on a new journey. This time, it was sent to Leningrad. In the autumn of 1942, near the Taitsi railway station, 30 kilometers from the city, the familiar work began again. Thousands of people once more built special tracks and a firing position, assembled the gun, and brought up the precious shells. Calculations were made, targets on the map of Leningrad chosen, and then nothing. The offensive for which the giant was intended was cancelled. The Wehrmacht's command decided to continue the blockade. The Gustav stood idle through the harsh winter of 1942-1943 on its position, turning into a colossal, mothballed idol. Thousands of soldiers guarded it. Anti-aircraft crews protected it from possible air raids. Invaluable trains with fuel and shells sat idle. All this while Army Group North was desperately in need of every single wagon of food and ammunition. Meanwhile, its sister, the gun Dora, was sent south to Stalingrad. History repeated itself with astonishing precision. In the summer of 1942, a giant position was again built near the city, costing weeks of labor. Dora fired several shots at the city. The exact number is disputed by historians, from a few to a dozen. But in the street fighting, where opponents fought for every room, 7-ton shells leaving craters the size of construction pits weren't just excessive, they were pointless. And in November, when the grand Soviet counteroffensive Uranus began, threatening to encircle the entire Sixth Army, Dora had to be frantically disassembled and evacuated. 25 wagons with the priceless cargo were pulled away from the front, saving the iron toy, while hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in the Stalingrad cauldron without supplies. The apotheosis of this tragic comedy was the Gustav's final use in 1944. They found a job for it, suppressing the Warsaw Uprising. The gun created to destroy the forts of the Maginot Line fired about 30 of its monstrous shells into the residential districts of the Polish capital. It was an act of unparalleled cruelty and, simultaneously, the final admission of the project's complete strategic bankruptcy. Using the most expensive artillery piece in history against rebel barricades was like using a microscope to hammer nails, supremely inefficient, wildly wasteful, and stupid. With that, the combat tally of the giants was closed. During the entire war, Gustav and Dora made fewer than 100 combat shots combined. They consumed resources comparable to maintaining an entire division, but their real contribution to the course of hostilities was a statistical error. Now, as the war rolled towards its finale and Germany was in its death throes, a final, ironic question arose. What to do with these two useless mountains of steel that couldn't be hidden and were pointless to use? Their fate was to become the logical conclusion to this entire story of illusions. Analyzing the Gustav's failure is an autopsy of a strategic corpse, where each pathology discovered is fatal on its own. Together, they form an irrefutable diagnosis. The weapon was doomed from the moment it left the drawing board. The first and unconditional sentence: the air. The Gustav wasn't just a large target, it was a geographical object. A structure 47 meters long, as tall as a multi-story building and 7 meters wide, is impossible to camouflage. Its position was visible to Allied pilots from dozens of kilometers away. For it to operate required not local air superiority, but absolute, total air supremacy along the entire complex logistical chain and for the entire 5-week deployment period. By 1943, when Allied air power grew strong and began to dominate the fronts, any use of the Gustav became a suicidal lottery. It could only function under ideal conditions, which Germany no longer had. The second sentence: stability. The war of engines dictated its own rules: rapid breakthroughs, operational pauses, counterattacks, retreats. The pace was measured in kilometers per day. The Gustav, however, lived in a different time dimension. 5 weeks, that's a period in which a front line could fundamentally change. While thousands of people built its special world of rails and cranes, the battle line could crawl forward or roll back, leaving the giant on a quiet, useless sector. It was a weapon of static, positional warfare, lost in an era of maneuver. The third sentence, the target. The Gustav's specialization was its curse. It was created to destroy super-strong permanent fortifications, meter-thick steel plates, and 7-meter concrete walls. But in the realities of World War II, there were catastrophically few such targets worthy of its extreme power and cost. The war was fought over cities, river crossings, road junctions, concentrations of manpower and equipment. Firing a 7-ton shell costing as much as a tank at a tank column or a residential district was not just wasteful, it was tactical insanity. Its hypertrophic power was useless against most real tasks. The fourth sentence, the rails. The monster was shackled for life to steel rails, not ordinary ones, but special, double, reinforced tracks that first had to be built. This absolute dependence on unique infrastructure was its Achilles heel. Under conditions where partisan sabotage and air raids systematically destroyed communications, guaranteeing the safe delivery and setup of the Gustav became an impossible task. It wasn't just immobile, it was paralyzed, a hostage to 2 narrow ribbons of steel going nowhere. The combination of these 4 sentences made the Gustav a tactical and operational relic. However, the real, deep-seated cause of its collapse lay not in tactics, but in the realm of time. The weapon's fundamental flaw was chronological. It was born fatally late, and this gap between conception and the new reality proved to be an unbridgeable chasm into which all the ambitions of its creators fell.
The failure of the Gustav was no accident. It was the inevitable combination of 4 fatal, insurmountable shortcomings, any one of which could have buried the project alone. Together, they formed a death sentence. Sentence 1. The air. The Gustav was the size of a small factory. Its 47-meter length and massive construction made camouflage absolutely impossible. Its operation required not just local air superiority, but complete, total air supremacy over the entire theater of war. By 1943, when Allied air power gained strength, any concentration of equipment at that scale immediately became a target for bombers. The gun could only function under conditions Germany was rapidly losing. Sentence 2. Stability. Deploying the Gustav required 5 weeks of titanic effort by thousands of people. This was a time frame from another era. The war on the Eastern Front was a war of giant mobile masses, where tank armies covered hundreds of kilometers in a week. The front was fluid, dynamic. While Krupp's engineers were assembling their cannon, the battle line could roll far back or move far forward, leaving the giant on an inactive, useless sector. Sentence 3. The target. The Gustav was a hyper-specialized weapon created to destroy super-strong permanent fortifications. But World War II, especially in the East, turned out to be a war of maneuver, deep breakthroughs and encirclements. It found almost no fortresses like the Maginot Line. Shooting 7-ton shells at tank columns, road junctions, or even cities was monstrously inefficient and wasteful, like hunting flies with a rocket launcher. Sentence 4. The rails. The monster was chained to rails. It could only move on specially reinforced double railway tracks, the construction of which was a monumental task in itself.
under conditions where partisans systematically disrupted communications and aircraft hunted railway junctions. Such dependence turned into a suicidal vulnerability. The Gustav wasn't just immobile, it was paralyzed, a hostage to its own infrastructure. The combination of these factors made the gun a tactical and operational relic, but the true, fundamental cause of its collapse lay even deeper. It wasn't in engineering, but in the perception of time. The Gustav's main flaw was chronological. It was born with a fatal delay of an entire era, and this fateful disconnect between conception and reality predetermined everything.
Spring 1945. Berlin burned in the fire of the Soviet assault, and from the west, the Allied armies advanced relentlessly. The Third Reich, now a shrinking cauldron, was squeezed tighter every day. And in this agony, in the depths of still unoccupied Bavaria, in the woods near the town of Auerbach, stood two of the most absurd and expensive monuments to Nazi ambition, Gustav and Dora. They stood on sidings or on pre-prepared positions that the war never reached. These steel colossi, each of which once required the attention of an entire army to move, were now abandoned. There was nowhere and no reason to evacuate them. All railways were cut or destroyed, no fuel, and most importantly, the very meaning of their existence had vanished. The war in which they could have been of any use had ended in complete defeat for Germany. The giants had turned into utterly useless, yet very heavy burdens. And then came the logical, almost symbolic finale. The German command, true to its principle of not leaving advanced technology to the enemy, gave the order for destruction. Sappers arrived at the guns. They didn't try to save or bury them. That was impossible. They methodically placed explosives in the most vulnerable points of the monstrous structures. Deafening explosions roared, echoing through the empty forest. The 47-meter barrels, the pride of the Krupp plant, were torn and twisted. The massive 80-wheeled carriages became piles of mangled metal. Thousands of tons of high-quality steel, into which millions of Reichsmarks and years of labor by the best engineers had been poured, turned into useless scrap in an instant. This wasn't death in battle. It was the ritual destruction of their own mistake, an attempt to erase the evidence of a grand strategic miscalculation. The irony of history reached its peak. The Maginot Line, that very concrete phantom that gave birth to the idea of the Gustav, survived the war. Its mighty forts that were supposed to fall under the blows of 7-ton shells never saw this monster. They surrendered without a fight when France fell, and after the war quietly served the French army or became tourist museums. And of the wonder weapon itself, almost nothing material remained. Just monstrously large shell casings, which in post-war Sebastopol were used for a time as water containers, and a few torn photographs in archives. Therefore, the story of the Schwerer Gustav is not a tale of power. It's a parable about blindness, about how brilliant technical intellect placed in the service of militaristic delusions of grandeur and stripped of strategic foresight can make titanic efforts in vain. It created a perfect tool, but for a job that no longer existed. The Gustav was born when the war it was conceived for, the war of positions and long sieges, was already ending. And the war that had arrived, the war of maneuver, speed, and deep operations, had no need for it. It became the most expensive and vivid lesson in military history.
It's not the biggest and most powerful weapon that wins, but the most relevant, flexible, and timely one. It was the perfect answer to a question that by the time it was ready, everyone had stopped asking.